Hello again, 102. In this video of chapter 29, we will define Reaganomics and try to evaluate some of its effects on American society and the economy. And politics is a performing art, all the more so in an age of television. And few politicians had Reagan's stage presence or confidence, and the Democrats consistently underestimated him. Just how revolutionary the Reagan era remains a subject of intense debate. But what cannot be denied is that Reagan's actions and beliefs set the tone for the decade's political and economic life. In his first term, he succeeded as president where Jimmy Carter failed for three main reasons. First, Reagan focused on a few essential priorities: lowering tax rates, reducing the scope of the federal government, increasing military spending, and conducting an anti-Soviet foreign policy. And he pursued those goals with what an aide called a warmly ruthless intensity. Second, Reagan, unlike Carter, was a shrewd negotiator with congressional leaders and foreign heads of state. He also recognized early on that governing a representative democracy requires compromises. He thus combined the passion of a revolutionary with the pragmatism of a diplomat. Third, Reagan's infectious optimism, like that of Franklin Roosevelt before him, gave people a sense of common purpose and renewed confidence. We have every right, he stressed, to dream heroic dreams. And Reaganomics defined this is supply-side economic philosophy, combining tax cuts with the goals of decreased government spending, a reduced regulation of business, and a balanced budget. This will not be achieved. This will not be achieved. They will get the tax cuts and reduced regulations, but the other two, no. Simply put, Reaganomics argued that the stagflation of the 1970s had resulted from excessive taxes, which weakened incentives for individuals and businesses to increase productivity, save money, and reinvest in economic expansion. The supply side or Reaganomics solution to stagflation was to slash tax rates on companies and individuals, especially on the wealthy, in the belief that they would spend their tax savings on business expansion and consumer goods, the supply side of the economy. And by generating economic growth, Reaganomics promised to generate enough new tax revenues from rising corporate profits and personal incomes to pay for the tax cuts. And this was called by his vice president while they were running against each other. George Herbert Walker Bush said this was voodoo economics, the belief that you're going to generate new tax revenues from tax cuts. In the short term, however, the Economic Recovery Tax Act did not work as planned. The federal budget deficit grew rather than shrank, and by November 1981, the economy was officially in recession. A slight one, explained the president. So they need more budget cuts now because they don't have enough government tax revenues. And 34-year-old David Stockman, Reagan's budget director and a former Michigan congressman, proposed sharp reductions in federal spending, including Social Security and Medicare, the two most expensive and most popular federal social welfare programs. Liberal Democrats howled at Stockman's efforts. They actually wanted to abolish Social Security early in '81, and they want to slash those budgets. Reagan responded that he was committed to maintaining the safety net of government services for the truly needy only. And this was a very unpopular move. And here, more than 5,000 seniors staged a demonstration in downtown Detroit against the cuts in the budget for Social Security. And this is in 1982. For all Reagan's bold talk about shrinking the government, he was not a true revolutionary in that regard. In the end, the president and Congress agreed to cut food stamps, the subsidies to help poor people buy groceries, only 4% from what the Carter administration had planned to spend. The Reagan administration also continued huge federal subsidies to corporations and agribusinesses, what critics called welfare for the rich. In the end, Reagan never dismantled the major federal social welfare programs that he had savagely criticized in the campaign. Within a year, David Stockman realized that the cuts in domestic spending approved by Reagan had fallen far short of what the president had promised. The massive increases in military spending greatly complicated the situation because, in essence, Reagan gave the Defense Department a blank check, telling the Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger to spend what you need. And over the next 5 years, the administration would spend some $1.2 trillion, in the largest peacetime military buildup ever, on military expenses. And something had to give. And because there's a huge growing federal deficit. Stockman and other worried aides finally convinced the president that the government needed revenue enhancements, a euphemism for tax increases. And with Reagan's grudging support, Congress passed a tax increase bill in 1982, forgotten by conservatives conveniently in this century, that would raise almost $100 billion. But the economic slump persisted for a time, with unemployment standing at 10.4%. And in the 1982 congressional midterm elections, Democrats picked up 26 seats in the House of Representatives. Yet Reagan's determination to stay the course in pursuing his economic program eventually began to pay off. And by the summer of 1983, a major economic recovery was underway, in part because of increased military spending. Government spending does create output, ladies and gentlemen. Lower interest rates, which started to come down after the double-digit rates that existed in the late 70s and early 1980s, and those lower tax rates from that Kemp-Roth tax cuts or the Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981. Reaganomics, however, was not helping to balance the budget. In fact, the annual federal deficits had grown larger, so much so that the president, who in 1980 had pledged to balance the federal budget by 1983, had in fact run up an accumulated federal debt larger than that of all of his predecessors combined. He was willing to tolerate the growing budget deficits in part because he believed they would force more responsible spending behavior in Congress, which it did not happen, and in part because he was so committed to increased military spending as a way to intimidate the Soviets. He did do some historic things, like appointing Sandra Day O'Connor, the first woman to serve on the Supreme Court, and she is confirmed in September of '81. But conservatives were very angry with her pro-abortion stance, and there will not be any moves against banning abortion at the federal level. That's going to happen later in the 80s and early 90s at the state level. And in the election of 1984, by 1983, prosperity had returned, generally speaking, and the stock market was soaring, and Reagan's supply-side economic program was at last working as advertised, except for the growing federal budget deficits. And by 1984, the mythology of Reagan begins. Reporters had begun to speak of the Reagan Revolution, and the slogan at the Republican National Convention was, "America is back and standing tall." The Democrats' presidential nominee, Jimmy Carter's Vice President Walter Mondale, struggled to present a competing vision. He was endorsed by the AFL-CIO and now and many prominent African Americans, and he also made history by choosing as his running mate Geraldine Ferraro, a New York congresswoman. A bit of frankness in Mondale's acceptance speech ended up hurting his campaign. Mr. Reagan will raise taxes to reduce the budget deficits, and so will I, he told the convention. He won't tell you. I just did. Reagan responded by vowing never to approve another tax increase, a promise he could not keep, and he also repeated a theme that he had used against Jimmy Carter. It's morning again in America, and record numbers of Americans were finding jobs, and in the end, Reagan took 59% of the popular vote and lost only Minnesota, Mondale's home state, and the District of Columbia. It was the worst defeat ever for a Democratic candidate. And in Reagan's second term, the main thing that will be done domestically, because he's more concerned with foreign policy in his second term, the Tax Reform Act of 1986 will be passed. And the measure, Dan Rostenkowski from Illinois sponsored this bill. It reduced the number of federal tax brackets from 14 to 2, and that has since been adjusted again. And it reduced rates from the maximum of 50 to 15 and 28 will now be the highest rate for a time, the lowest since Calvin Coolidge was president in the 1920s. In the end, this was a half-hearted revolution. Ronald Wilson Reagan was the first president since Eisenhower to complete 2 full terms in office, although in 1981 he had proclaimed his intention to curb the size and influence of the federal establishment. He did not, in part because the Democrats controlled the House of Representatives throughout his presidency. The number of federal employees actually grew during the Reagan presidency. Neither Social Security nor Medicare, the 2 largest federal social welfare programs, were overhauled. Social Security was actually blustered by some of those tax increases during Reagan's 2-term presidency, and that saved the program, and we're pretty much to that point again now in 2018. It's going to need more revenues. And the federal agencies that Reagan had threatened to abolish, like energy and the Department of Education, not only survived, but they saw their budgets grow. The federal budget deficit tripled during his 2 terms. The cost of Social Security, the most expensive government entitlement program, grew by 27%, as some 6,000 Americans each day turned 65, and many more so will in the coming years. Moreover, Reagan failed to fulfill his campaign promises to the Christian right, such as reinstituting daily prayer in public schools and enacting a ban on abortions. During his 2 terms, he was much more successful in transforming the judicial system than in ending the welfare state. He appointed 368 mostly conservative judges, 3 of whom were added to the U.S. Supreme Court: Mrs. O'Connor, as we just talked about, Antonin Scalia, who will serve for many years. He just passed away a couple years ago, and Anthony Kennedy. Martin Anderson, Reagan's domestic policy advisor, stressed that it was a mistake to think that there was ever a Reagan revolution or that Reagan gave it life. It was a grassroots conservative revolution, like the tax revolts that caused Reagan. And those same forces will continue to the end of the century. What Reagan did accomplish was to end the prolonged period of economic stagflation and set in motion what economists called the Great Expansion, an unprecedented 20-year-long burst of productivity and prosperity. True, Reagan's presidency left the nation with a massive debt burden that would eventually cause problems, but the great communicator also renewed the nation's strength, self-confidence, and soaring sense of possibilities.